Helios Station shook with the force of the enemy's initial assault. Explosions rocked its outer hull as massive plasma bolts and missile barrages struck the station's defenses. Alarms blared through the corridors, and the sound of scrambling footsteps echoed as soldiers and crew rushed to their positions. Helios was more than just a waypoint. It was a lifeline, a crucial hub on a galactic trade route that kept supply lines open and economies running. Losing it would mean handing the enemy a major strategic advantage, and that was a risk the defenders could not afford. In the midst of the chaos, a calm voice cut through the noise, a direct transmission to the command deck. Enemy fleet approaching from Vector 329. Prepare for immediate engagement. The enemy's plan was clear: overwhelm Helios with sheer numbers and firepower, sever the trade route, and strangle the sector. They had brought a fleet large enough to do just that, and the defending forces were quickly realizing they were outmatched. Within the heart of Helios Station, a lone figure observed the chaos with a steady, unblinking gaze. This was Deadeye, a human sniper known for his extraordinary precision and nerves of steel. He was stationed in a concealed position deep within the infrastructure of the station, where he had an unobstructed view of the vast expanse of space outside. His mission was simple but nearly impossible: protect the convoy of Allied ships attempting to flee Helios Station and buy them enough time to escape. It was a task that seemed doomed from the start, but Deadeye was not one to back down. His orders were clear: disable or destroy any threat to the convoy, no matter how insignificant. Every ship, every fighter, every drone that posed even the slightest danger needed to be neutralized. Deadeye had spent hours studying the enemy fleet's tactics and movements. He knew they would come in waves, each one more determined than the last, but he was prepared. His sniper rifle, a custom-built piece of machinery with enhancements that extended far beyond standard military issue, rested lightly against his shoulder. The first enemy fighters emerged from the darkness like a swarm of locusts, moving swiftly towards the convoy. Deadeye steadied his breathing, his hands unwavering as he peered through the scope, analyzing their trajectory. A breath. A squeeze of the trigger. One of the enemy fighters exploded into a ball of flame, its fragments scattering into the void. Another breath, another shot, 2 more fighters down before they even realized what had hit them. Each shot was a masterclass in precision, his timing flawless, his aim deadly. The enemy fleet soon recognized the unseen threat and shifted their focus. They launched a second wave, this time with more heavily armored ships designed to withstand the station's defenses. Deadeye adjusted his position slightly, recalibrating his scope for the new targets. His hands moved with practiced ease, each motion efficient and precise. He lined up his next shot and fired, aiming for a weak spot in the enemy's shielding. The round pierced through, detonating the engine of a corvette, sending it spiraling out of control. Deadeye continued his relentless assault, picking off smaller threats with methodical precision. His skill was immediately apparent to anyone watching the battle unfold. His shots were so accurate, they seemed to defy the laws of physics. He anticipated movements before they happened, as if he could read the minds of the enemy pilots. With every shot, he created chaos within the enemy ranks, sowing fear and confusion. The enemy, undeterred, escalated their attack. Larger ships moved into position, targeting Helios Station with devastating volleys. Deadeye remained calm, calculating, his heartbeat steady as he focused on the task. He received new orders: prioritize targets that posed the greatest threat to the convoy. He knew time was running out, but he had no intention of failing. He switched to a different ammunition type, designed for maximum penetration, and aimed for a cluster of bombers preparing to launch a coordinated strike. He fired rapidly, each bullet finding its mark with unerring accuracy. One by one, the bombers fell from the sky, their engines sputtering, their pilots ejecting into the cold vacuum of space. The convoy, for the moment, remained safe, but Deadeye knew this was only the beginning. The enemy would not relent. They would come harder and faster with every passing second. His earpiece crackled with a new directive from the command deck. The enemy is massing for a full frontal assault. Deadeye, we need you to thin their numbers before they breach our defenses. He acknowledged the order, his expression unchanged. He had already calculated the best angles of attack, the optimal trajectories, the critical points of impact. His mind worked at a pace that matched the tension of the battlefield. He was not just shooting, he was orchestrating a defense, turning the chaos of battle into a controlled environment. The next wave came in, larger and more formidable. Deadeye didn't hesitate. His rifle discharged shot after shot, disabling engines, rupturing fuel tanks, and tearing through armor plating. Every pull of the trigger was an act of defiance against an overwhelming enemy force, a reminder that the battle was far from over. As the enemy's assault continued, the situation grew more desperate. Deadeye knew that the margin for error was razor thin. He could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him, but he thrived under pressure. His eyes never left the scope, his mind focused on the singular goal: protect the convoy at all costs. The stakes were high, but he had faced worse odds before. Deadeye's focus sharpened as he zeroed in on a new set of targets. The enemy had started to realize that their advance was being disrupted by an unseen force, something beyond the reach of their sensors or understanding. Their ships, one after another, were being struck down with alarming precision. Engines flared, fuel tanks ignited, and pilots were cut down mid-maneuver. Each shot was a testament to Deadeye's mastery. He was calm, methodical, reading the battlefield like a chessboard where he was always 3 moves ahead. He aimed again, this time targeting the engine of an approaching frigate. His fingers moved smoothly across the controls, adjusting for distance, velocity, and atmospheric drag. He exhaled slowly, steadied his aim, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet flew through the void, tearing through the vacuum with unerring speed. A split second later, the engine of the frigate exploded in a brilliant flash, sending shards of metal spiraling out into space. The ship veered off course, spinning uncontrollably, its systems fried. The enemy fleet hesitated, their movements growing erratic. The pilots and commanders were starting to understand they were up against something far beyond a typical sniper. Fear began to seep into their ranks. Their advance slowed as they struggled to figure out where the attacks were coming from. Deadeye watched them with a cold detachment, recognizing the signs of panic. He was disrupting their rhythm, forcing them to make mistakes. That was his edge, and he intended to exploit it fully. He spotted a fuel tanker moving towards the front lines, a clear sign that the enemy was trying to resupply and regroup. Deadeye adjusted his scope, factoring in the speed and trajectory of the tanker. He needed to hit it just right, in the most vulnerable spot. He breathed in, held for a moment, then fired. The bullet pierced the hull, hitting the fuel reserve, and in an instant, the tanker erupted into a massive fireball, lighting up the darkness like a small sun. The shockwave rattled the nearby ships, adding to the confusion. The enemy's command began frantically issuing new orders, trying to regain control, but the damage was done. Deadeye had forced them to react, and every reaction came with mistakes. They were beginning to sense his presence, but not enough to pinpoint him. A cruiser turned sharply, scanning for any sign of his position. Deadeye smirked, knowing they were still blind. He fired again, taking out the cruiser's communication array, silencing their commands. Chaos ensued, spreading like wildfire across the fleet. The enemy, desperate to eliminate the threat, sent in a wave of fighters and bombers to flush him out. Deadeye watched them approach, his heartbeat steady, his breathing calm. His mind raced through the calculations: speed, angle, wind currents. He could see their tactics, knew they were trying to overwhelm him with numbers. But numbers meant nothing if they couldn't hit their target. He began firing rapidly, each shot as precise as the last. Fighters exploded in midair, bombers spiraled out of control. Each bullet seemed to defy the laws of probability, finding its mark with surgical precision. Despite his success, the pressure was mounting. The enemy was adapting, sending more and more ships into the fray, determined to corner him. Deadeye could feel the strain on his body, the fatigue creeping into his muscles. But he couldn't afford to stop. He adjusted his position, shifted his aim, and kept firing, every shot counting, every second critical. The enemy pilots, realizing they were being picked off one by one, started to falter. He could see the hesitation in their movements, the slight stutters in their maneuvers. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Deadeye noticed a squadron of bombers breaking away from the main fleet, moving in a tight formation towards the convoy. They were heavily armored, built to withstand most forms of attack, but Deadeye knew they were vulnerable in one specific area: their payload bays. If he could hit those precisely, he could take them all out before they reached the convoy. He didn't have much time. The bombers were closing in fast. Deadeye's mind focused like a laser. He switched to rapid-fire mode, recalibrating for the bomber's speed and distance. He aimed at the lead bomber, calculated the trajectory, and fired. The bullets sliced through the air, hitting the payload bay dead center. The bomber erupted into a massive explosion, taking out two others in its wake. Without pausing, Deadeye adjusted his aim and fired again, downing another bomber with a single shot. The remaining bombers veered wildly, trying to evade his shots, but Deadeye was relentless. One by one, he picked them off, each shot finding its mark. The final bomber, desperate, tried to make a last-ditch run for the convoy, but Deadeye tracked its every move. He took a breath, steadied himself, and fired. The bullet struck true, and the last bomber exploded, debris scattering harmlessly away from the convoy. The immediate threat was neutralized, but Deadeye knew this was just the beginning. He could see the enemy regrouping, preparing for another assault. His mind was already calculating the next moves, analyzing the enemy's shifting tactics. Deadeye's focus remained razor-sharp as the battle raged on. The enemy's tactics were shifting rapidly, trying to adapt to the relentless precision of his attacks. He stayed vigilant, scanning the battlefield, calculating each move with a cold, practiced detachment. His mission was clear, and there was no room for mistakes. Every shot counted, every second mattered. Then, without warning, an unexpected blip appeared on his radar, moving erratically through the combat zone. It was a ship, but not one marked in any of the mission briefings or identified on his target list. It moved slowly, seemingly without any awareness of the battle unfolding around it. Deadeye quickly assessed its size and speed, too small to be a warship, and not maneuvering like a military vessel. It looked like a civilian transport, but its presence here made no sense. How could a ship like that wander into a live combat zone? Deadeye's eyes flickered between the unregistered ship and his primary targets. There was no time to investigate. The enemy bombers were moving in fast, closing the distance to the convoy. He needed to focus. The transport ship was not a threat, just a strange anomaly. He dismissed it, and returned his attention to the enemy fighters bearing down on the Allied vessels. He steadied his aim, aligning his scope with the lead bomber. A breath. A heartbeat. He pulled the trigger. The bullet flew true, striking the bomber's engine, and it burst into flames. He quickly moved to the next target, but then, in the blink of an eye, everything went wrong. The transport ship veered suddenly, cutting directly into his line of fire. His finger had already squeezed the trigger. The shot found its mark, not on the enemy, but on the transport's fuel core. A flash of light, then an enormous explosion tore through the battlefield. The blast was deafening, a bright ball of fire that consumed the transport in an instant. Deadeye's eyes widened in disbelief as he watched the civilian ship disintegrate, fragments scattering like shrapnel across the void. He realized too late what had happened. A chill ran through him as the gravity of the mistake sank in. He had fired on a civilian vessel. He didn't know who was on board or how many lives had just been lost, but he understood immediately that it was bad, very bad. His mind raced, replaying the moment over and over, trying to find some justification, some reason, but there was none. The ship had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and now it was gone, reduced to nothing but debris and smoke. For a brief moment, everything seemed to stop. The battle noises, the alarms, the commands, all faded into the background. Deadeye felt the weight of his actions like a physical blow. The transport hadn't been a threat, hadn't been part of the mission. He had been too focused, too consumed by the task at hand to notice the unexpected complication in time. But there was no time to dwell on the mistake. He forced himself to push the guilt aside, to swallow the knot forming in his throat. The convoy still needed his protection, and the enemy was already regrouping, capitalizing on the momentary lapse. Deadeye snapped back into action, realigning his scope, preparing for the next wave. His heart was heavy, but his hand was steady. He knew he couldn't afford another mistake. Yet, the damage was already done. The enemy, sensing an opportunity, moved quickly to exploit it. Within moments, the comms were flooded with messages, broadcasts, and intercepted signals. The destruction of the civilian transport ship was being painted as an intentional attack, a deliberate act by a human sniper who cared nothing for innocent lives. "See how the humans kill without remorse?" one transmission blared. "They target our people indiscriminately." The enemy's propaganda machine worked at lightning speed, spreading the news of the atrocity across every channel, every frequency. They knew how to weaponize the narrative, turning Deadeye's mistake into a rallying cry against all human forces. Images of the destroyed transport flashed across the screens, accompanied by frantic, grieving voices claiming a massacre. The story took on a life of its own, twisting the facts into a tale of human cruelty and disregard for life. Deadeye felt the weight of the accusations pressing down on him. He was aware of how easily stories could spread in wartime, how quickly a single incident could change the course of history. The enemy was using his mistake to turn the tide of public opinion against humans, to paint them as monsters, merciless and unthinking. And he knew deep down that they might succeed. Still, he couldn't let it paralyze him. The convoy was still out there, still moving, still vulnerable. He refocused, forcing his mind back to the task. He had to keep fighting, had to complete the mission, no matter the cost. The cries of outrage, the accusations, they would have to wait. He would deal with the fallout later, if he survived this day. As he took aim once more, he felt a new weight in his hands. His confidence, his certainty, had been shaken, but he was still a soldier, and soldiers did not have the luxury of regret in the heat of battle. He steadied his breath. Deadeye's rifle fell silent as the last of the enemy fighters retreated into the darkness, their ranks broken and scattered. The convoy had made it out, engines roaring as they disappeared into the safety of Allied space. Helios Station, though battered and scorched, remained intact. The mission, at least on paper, was a success. But there was no sense of triumph in the air. The cost of that success was etched deeply into Deadeye's mind, overshadowing any sense of accomplishment. The image of the civilian transport's explosion replayed in his head, the fiery blast and debris lingering like a dark cloud. He tried to push it away, to focus on the task at hand, but the weight of that moment was crushing. The convoy might have escaped, but the real damage had only just begun. News of the incident spread faster than the escaping ships. Within hours, alien media channels blared reports of the so-called execution at Helios. Every broadcast, every headline seemed to twist the knife a little deeper, turning Deadeye's unintended mistake into a symbol of human savagery. "Human sniper targets innocents!" they screamed. "Cowardly attack on helpless civilians!" Alien commentators filled the airwaves with outrage, their voices dripping with contempt. They painted a picture of a remorseless killer, a sniper who had deliberately fired on an unarmed ship. The story was everywhere, and it was growing. Deadeye's face was plastered across screens and holofeeds, his name dragged through the mud. Alien journalists, diplomats, and leaders condemned the action with fervor, calling for justice, for retribution. In a matter of hours he had gone from being a nameless soldier on a mission to the most hated figure in the galaxy. The image of the explosion, of innocent lives lost, was played over and over, a relentless barrage of anger and accusation. Misinformation spread like wildfire. Wild rumors filled the void, each more outrageous than the last. Some said he had taken a bribe, that he was a rogue operating on his own agenda. Others claimed that this was a human tactic, that snipers like him were trained to instill terror, to kill without hesitation or remorse. Deadeye felt the weight of these lies crushing down on him. He knew the truth, knew that it had been an accident, a split-second decision in the chaos of battle, but the galaxy didn't want the truth. It wanted a scapegoat. The political fallout was immediate and severe. Diplomatic relations between humanity and several alien species began to unravel. Treaties were suspended, ambassadors recalled, and borders tightened. In sector after sector, human snipers were outlawed, their presence declared illegal. Bounties were placed on their heads, with rewards high enough to draw in every bounty hunter and mercenary within reach. Deadeye's name was at the top of every list. He was marked, hunted, a fugitive in a galaxy that had turned against him. Orders came through from his superiors. Lay low, go dark. He was to disappear, to vanish into the shadows until things cooled down. But Deadeye knew better. He knew that things would not cool down, not now, not ever. The anger, the hatred, it was too deep, too raw. The galaxy had found a villain, and it wasn't about to let go. As he retreated to a hidden safe house, he couldn't escape the growing awareness that his actions, unintended as they were, had unleashed something far bigger than he had ever imagined. He was a sniper, trained to fight from the shadows, to strike with precision and disappear. Now, he found himself in a different kind of battle, one fought not with bullets, but with perception and reputation. And in that battle, he was losing. Deadeye felt a conflict deep within. He was a soldier. He had followed his orders, done his duty. But the weight of the innocent lives lost hung over him like a shroud. Could he have done something differently? Should he have waited a second longer, double-checked his aim? The questions gnawed at him, each one a sharp blade slicing into his conscience. He tried to shake them off, to remind himself that it had been an accident, but it was no use. The galaxy saw him as a monster, and some part of him feared they might be right. He spent days moving between safe houses, always a step ahead of those who hunted him. His face was too well known now, his name too infamous. Every alien port, every city, was plastered with wanted posters and holoscreens flashing warnings. He felt the net closing in around him, the walls tightening, and knew there was no escape from what he had become. Messages from his commanders were few and far between, mostly vague reassurances that they were working to resolve the situation diplomatically. But Deadeye knew that was impossible. This was more than politics. It was a story that had taken on a life of its own. A story fueled by fear, anger, and hatred. No amount of negotiation could change that. He began to feel the isolation, the loneliness of his new reality. He was cut off from his allies, his friends, his world. Everywhere he turned, he saw reminders of the explosion, the tragedy that had set all this in motion. His only connection to humanity now was a covert channel, a lifeline that grew thinner by the day. Deadeye's resolve wavered, the burden of being the face of a hated group weighing heavily on his shoulders. He had to remind himself why he fought, why he had taken the mission in the first place. He knew he was more than the mistake that had defined him. But in the eyes of the galaxy, that was all he was. A sniper, a killer, an enemy to be feared and loathed. And so, he continued to move, continued to hide, knowing that he might never clear his name, might never change the narrative. But he was a soldier, and soldiers didn't give up. He had a duty, even if that duty was now only to survive, to exist in the shadows cast by his own actions. Deadeye moved through the dark corners of the galaxy like a shadow, always one step ahead of those who hunted him. The bounty on his head grew larger with each passing day, attracting mercenaries, bounty hunters, and opportunists from every star system. He had become a target, a marked man, and he knew it. Every planet, every station, every outpost felt like a trap waiting to spring. But he kept moving, kept hiding, driven by a need to survive and a desire to find some meaning in what had happened. The guilt was a constant companion, a weight that bore down on him in every quiet moment. He saw the faces of the innocent lives lost in the explosion at Helios every time he closed his eyes. The explosion, the fire, the scattering debris, it haunted him. He knew he couldn't change what had happened, couldn't bring back the lives lost, but the burden of that knowledge gnawed at him. He was still a soldier, still loyal to his people, but he was painfully aware that his actions, however unintended, had altered the galaxy's perception of human snipers forever. Stories of the execution at Helios. continued to spread, becoming more twisted and exaggerated with each retelling. In some versions, he was portrayed as a cold-blooded killer, a human weapon with no regard for life. In others, he was a ghost, a specter who appeared out of nowhere to rain death upon the innocent. Human snipers were no longer seen as mere soldiers. They had become something more sinister, phantoms who struck without warning, assassins who cared nothing for collateral damage. The galaxy's fear grew, and with it, the hatred. Deadeye could feel the legend growing around him, a legend that painted him in the darkest colors imaginable. He knew he was no longer just a man. He was an idea, a symbol of everything the galaxy feared about humans. Every hostile glance, every whispered conversation, every bounty hunter who came after him was a reminder that he was living under the shadow of a story he couldn't control. And yet, he refused to let it break him. Despite the hatred, despite the bounty, Deadeye made a decision. He wouldn't hide forever. He wouldn't let the narrative be written entirely by those who sought to demonize him. He found a way to tap into an old communication network, one that spanned several sectors, and he broadcast a message, clear and defiant. "We fight for our own, but we never kill without cause." His voice echoed through the channels. "Remember who fired the first shot." It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't an admission of guilt. It was a reminder, a challenge to those who would twist the truth to suit their own ends. The message rippled through the galaxy, reaching ears both hostile and sympathetic. It was a small gesture, but it mattered. Deadeye knew it wouldn't change the minds of those who had already condemned him, but perhaps it would make them think, make them remember that there were always two sides to every story. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't asking for mercy. He was simply stating a fact, that he was a soldier, caught in a war he hadn't started. With his message sent, Deadeye returned to the shadows, knowing he was still hunted, still hated. He had no illusions about his future. He might never clear his name, might never find redemption. But he refused to give up. There were still battles to fight, still missions that needed his skills. He moved like a ghost, navigating the dark alleys of forgotten stations, slipping past patrols, always one step ahead of those who sought to bring him down. He knew his name would continue to be spoken in hushed tones, that tales of his deeds, both real and imagined, would grow with time. He accepted that he might forever be remembered as the villain in someone else's story. But he also knew that history was never as simple as the stories people told. The truth was buried beneath layers of fear and anger, and while he might never be able to peel back all those layers, he could live with the choices he had made. He embraced the shadows, the solitude, and the uncertainty of his path. He had become a symbol, a representation of human resilience in the face of an unforgiving galaxy. A sniper, a soldier, a fugitive, he was all of these things, and none of them defined him entirely. He kept moving, kept fighting, knowing that in a galaxy that had already passed judgment, his story was far from over. And so, Deadeye remained a solitary figure, always on the run, always looking over his shoulder, but never stopping, never surrendering. He knew that he might never find peace, might never reclaim his honor in the eyes of those who hated him. But he also knew that he still had a fight left in him, a purpose beyond the bounty on his head. He was not defined by the hatred of others, but by his refusal to be broken by it. In the end, he walked the line between legend and reality, a man shaped by both his deeds and the myths that surrounded them. His story continued, written in the shadows, carried on in whispers and rumors across the stars.